the getting in early, building relationships to get information is incredibly important, because 9 times out of 10 we'll get wind of something before it's even filed. If it's a piece of legislation, someone will chatter and say, hey, Representative so-and-so is thinking about filing a bill on blah. And we typically can talk with that member ahead of time. All else fails, you wait until the bill's filed, and then you immediately jump in and start providing comment.
Welcome to the AttractionPros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman, founder of BackLooper. I help attractions collect guest feedback and identify top priorities needed for improvement.
And I'm Matt Heller, founder of Performance Optimist Consulting. I help leaders lead so they can increase employee engagement and retention.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the AttractionPros podcast.
Hey, Josh, how are you?
I'm doing great, Matt. How are you?
I am fantastic today.
Do you think there'll ever be another episode where you don't say that? Not that I don't want you to.
I don't think I cannot say it now.
Right. I think our audience has come to expect it.
Well, and I was just going to say, unless we get so much feedback from the audience that says, Matt, just don't ever say that again, I will probably keep saying it. But I have a question for you that's not related to me saying fantastic. Josh, do you know what a lobbyist does?
I do now, but I will say that I learned it very recently.
Me too. I have heard the term lobbyist before, and a lot of times it's in a really negative connotation. So I'm really excited to have Jennifer Green on today from Liberty Partners in Tallahassee, because she is the lobbyist and her firm that really helped the Florida Attractions Association and a lot of other organizations to have a better relationship with the government. And I think that's one of the things that I take away from this is she's really an advocate, an interpreter, an educator, all those things wrapped up into the title of a lobbyist.
Right. Absolutely. So, so this will be a very, I would say, Florida-centric episode and interview, because she's based in Tallahassee. She works specifically with the Florida government. We talk about the Florida Attractions Association many times, along with specific members as well. But if, let's say, you're listening or you're watching and you're not from Florida, I think everything that we talk about is very widely applicable. Even if you're outside the US, that it's just very, it's a very interesting conversation to learn about, I would say, the law process, as well as everything that Jennifer and her firm Liberty Partners has been doing since the beginning of COVID. So we definitely talk a lot about the specific actions taken there. And it's really cool to, I would say, get into that granular detail of really what we saw on the news of, here are the plans and, here's what lobbyists have been doing. So now we get to, I would say, unpack that or peel back the onion, as we like to talk about a lot, or use that phrase a lot, and really get into I would say, the nitty gritty of what goes on to be able to do that. And of course we talk about COVID, but we talk about a number of other issues as well, including how important it is to get involved, to vote, but also to be involved with your local trade association, and even running for a local government if you've got the ability and bandwidth to be able to do that. So we cover all of that in this awesome interview.
Yeah, and I would say if you're someone, even if you don't live in Florida, and even if if thinking about the law and government kind of scares you, and I'll be honest, I don't know a whole heck of a lot about it, but if you like behind the scenes type of documentaries, you're going to get a lot of behind the scenes information today about really what goes on, how the butter's made, when you really get to hear what Jennifer talks about. So I can't wait to get to it.
I'd say let's get to it right now.
Here we go. Jennifer Green from Liberty Partners in Tallahassee, Florida. Thank you so much for joining us on the AttractionPros podcast. How are you doing today, Jennifer?
Doing great, Matt. Thanks for the invite.
Absolutely. So excited to talk to you. Of course, we would have gotten to see you in person at the Florida Attractions Association conference, but sadly that got canceled. So it's great to see you here. Can you first of all give us just a quick overview of Liberty Partners and how you are connected with the attractions industry?
Absolutely, absolutely. We are a governmental consulting firm, which means that we lobby, do other types of consulting for whether it's a for-profit, not-for-profit client. We have a fair amount of clients in the association world, and that's a really good example of how FAA came to us. I came out of the association industry. I worked for the Florida Bankers Association, and then for about 10 years for the Florida Institute of CPAs. And when FAA was looking for a lobbyist, we put together a proposal and basically brought in a lot of our association management experience, understanding, working with a board. It's more than just going to the Capitol saying, here's what issues are important to the attractions industry. There's also member involvement. There's also fundraising for your PAC. There's a whole host of things. And that was about, I think it's 6 years or so, somewhere around there. So interview with Bill was tough.
Yeah, he's a tough cookie. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of that support mechanism you provide for the FAA?
Absolutely. So we're very cyclical because our legislative session is as well. And so when we're not in the session in the spring, we'll just call that the first quarter of the year. The rest of the year, there's still a lot going on. You're preparing for session, your elections, we're monitoring or interviewing candidates on an election year, bringing recommendations to, Bill Lutfer and FAA's Political Action Committee. But they're also rulemaking. I mean, for example, great example was there was an issue with the Bureau of Fair Rides, and it came up about, it's been 3 years ago now, because I think Putnam was ag commissioner at the time, and it was a topic that ended up, an issue started off in Ohio, and it was a internal staffer thought, oh, this sounds good. This is going to make the commissioner look good. And when it was about to be put into practice via rule, it was like, whoa, do you understand what the cost? And do you understand what you're asking all of these facilities? It wasn't the large facilities, they went beyond the carnivals. And I think that's what they were trying, the non-permanent rides is what they were trying to affect. So we were able to, jump in on Bill's behalf and work with the agency to be able to say, whoa, can we pump the brakes here, set up a few meetings and walk through, some concepts, and then also get feedback from FAA members to bring those real life examples to say, okay, this is who you're affecting. Is this who you mean to affect? So it was, again, making that connection between the association, the real life members, and the actual regulator and how that's affecting those folks.
That's really interesting. Can you expand on that a little bit, or walk us through that process of when something like that gets introduced into government legislation, and then where you would get involved, and specifically what those actions look like to be able to work on behalf of your clients for instance, like FAA, like the example you mentioned?
Sure. Well, it's kind of a two-pronged approach, because we have the executive branch, which is executive agencies, and so you've got the entire cabinet and all the agencies that fall under it, and then you've got the legislature, which is the House and Senate. So if it's an issue related to the legislature, probably more easier to describe. It's very cyclical, and it also is very prescribed. Florida has one of the strongest public records laws, probably in the U.S. I mean, our sunshine statutes are fabulous. So what that means is you can't sneak in meetings. They can't just have a meeting. There is a process that meetings have to be posted for both, the legislature and the executive branch. In terms of the legislature, we have extensive bill tracking systems that we use. We also, bounce off the House and Senate websites as well as a backup. But as bills are filed, we're reading every piece of legislation that's coming through. We're searching for keywords, key statutes, and we start tracking legislation. Some years you've got up to 3,000 bills that are filed. And so we put together for Bill a tracking list. So we'll say, hey, Bill, this bill popped out. House Bill, 37, here's what we think it does. We're going to talk to the Senate sponsor, before he files a companion, here's what's going on here. So we try to get it certainly ahead of time, but once legislation is filed, it's public. And then as it moves through the process and it starts to be referred to committees and heard in committees, we work through getting information from Bill and his folks to say, all right, what's the concern here? What's the problem with the way the statute is written, and what can we do to make it better? Usually giving a legislator that's filing, that's sponsoring a bill and saying, well, your bill stinks, and not giving them something to do to make it better is not a good approach. So we typically do that. Sometimes it's proactive legislation. We worked on a couple years ago. It was related to, they called it was like kiddie gambling. It was actually pretty funny. Remember the claw games? Well, when the legislature went after all of basically the online, gambling, the portals, those internet cafe kind of things, they unintentionally pulled in claw games, whether or not they're a game of chance or they're not a game of chance and where they're regulated. And so you had like Dave & Buster's and several other, companies that have these big machines. And it was like, the legislature said, well, that's not what we meant to do. And what we ended up doing, which was interesting, is going into a different area of the statute. So the conflict still is in the gaming statutes, but we went into the family amusements section of the statute, made the change there, and basically explained that is not gambling. That is a game of chance. So when you have one of those claw things, there's no skill involved in it. It's whether or not you can, there's not really any skill. So that would be a good example. On the executive branch side, what I mentioned with regard to the Department of Ag and Consumer Services putting out a rule, they basically noticed a rule for development. It was actually a piece of legislation that the Ag Commissioner had filed the year prior that we went, whoa, let's pump the brakes on. So all of a sudden it shows up in a rule instead, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And we were able to work with the agency, the Bureau of Fair Rides, with their staff, talk through the concerns, make them realize there is, a difference between carnies and we'll say the Disneys of the world, the very large, permanent rides. There are permanent rides. Fun Spot, Orlando is a great example. They didn't even think about that. They've got, little rides in there in and out, and they're permanent, but they're not a fixed facility for purposes of some licensure requirements. So I think, to summarize both avenues, whether it's going through the executive branch, one of those agencies, or going through the legislature, I think that the getting in early, building relationships to get information is incredibly important, because 9 times out of 10 we'll get wind of something before it's even filed. If it's a piece of legislation, someone will chatter and say, hey, Representative so-and-so is thinking about filing a bill on blah. And we typically can talk with that member ahead of time. All else fails, you wait until the bill's filed, and then you immediately jump in and start providing comment. But I think it's the important part, regardless of either a rulemaking situation or a legislative situation, lawmaking situation, is getting the discussion out there, not trying to jump into the last minute, and actually having a solution. So not just going, as I said before, I don't like this, but here's why, and here's a solution. Yeah. They may not take the solution, but again, 9 times out of 10, people come up with great ideas. And if you're able to tell them, this is a great idea, but here's what it does, in practice, it actually does this, they're more willing to change it. Sometimes they don't, but for the most part, they're more willing.
So it really sounds like you're an advocate, but you're also an interpreter, right?
Way to put it. Both ways sometimes, because we have to take what we hear from the agency or that legislator and break it down into layman's terms, or terms that are, depending on the client, explaining to them, what does that actually mean?
So does that encapsulate what a lobbyist does? Because I think sometimes lobbyists get a bad rap, but what I'm hearing is something that is, if I were an operator, man, I would love to have somebody like you that was looking out for me and interpreting these things. So did you just kind of encapsulate what a lobbyist does, or are there more?
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good, there's other things that happen with it, obviously, but it's your eyes and your ears and your boots on the ground, watching, being that watchdog on your regulator or the legislature, making sure something bad doesn't happen to you. I mean, at the end of the day, members of FAA, they need to run their businesses. They don't need to be, we need to pull them in when we need information. And that's, I think, the other important part is, regardless of your client, whether it's an association or private business, there has to be a two-way street where when you go back to that client and say, okay, we've, put a halt on it. We know it's a problem. Now explain to me why why it is a problem, and to be able to provide that, that data is important. So educator, I would say a watchdog and an educator as well, and a little bit of a nudger at the end.
Yeah. So how does it differ then for working with an association? We talked about FAA versus working with private businesses in terms of what your relationship is with them, and then I would say the actions that you're taking on their behalf.
It's probably when you're working with a private business, you can be a little more nimble because you typically have one point of contact, whether it's their government relations director or their CEO or their general counsel. It's probably pretty narrow, but you also can get an answer and move a lot quicker. With associations with governing boards, it's a little tougher. We always encourage our clients, and we do this with FAA, we encourage them every year to develop a set of legislative and regulatory policies, a written document that says, this is what we believe, we support, we oppose, whatever, but in a document so that we've got a guidebook. We can compare that to legislation, being filed and whatnot. It's when it's outside that we'll go back to Bill or again, another association and say, all right, this is not, you haven't anticipated this issue. Here's the issue. We think it's a problem. We think you should, from a governance standpoint, go back to your board or whoever has a responsibility for, approving those policies, go ahead and get them to say, yes, we approve this. Because then it carries the weight of the entire organization. So sometimes it takes a little bit longer. And that was the call I was just on before you all, was another trade association. And we spent an hour trying to herd cats and get their legislative agenda. And we went off on a deep end. And, we just kept having to say, all right, okay. So we're going to do a next meeting. Let's talk about what you're going to see in between meetings. So it's kind of paring down everybody's interests and then getting everyone to agree that, hey, the organization should take a position on this.
So Jennifer, you just mentioned, working with a private company might be a little bit more nimble because you've got one point of contact. And you mentioned, somebody that's working with government relations. What about a smaller facility that doesn't have someone that's dedicated to that? A mom and pop attraction, is it their relationship with the association that is kind of they're in with someone like you, or what would be your recommendation for them, knowing that these pieces of legislation are going to affect them?
Sure. Great. I'll give you a real life example. And Sawgrass Recreation Park, Christy Sovereigns, they're down there. They're good people. They're great people. They had an issue come up and went to Bill and said, can we talk to Jennifer about this? And it was about a land lease. It was a really serious, big cabinet issue. They had done 95%, maybe even 98% of the legwork on it. It was the as business owners being nervous about, okay, what's going to happen? Is it going to get approved? Is it not? What's the timing on it? So we were able to step in and just, again, we usually try not to get involved in Bill's members' individual issues, but that was one of those. It was easy to do in terms of getting the information because they had done basically all the work. We were just reconfirming what they already knew and going, nope, there's no problems. We see no issues over here. It could be a specific issue to a client, like a licensure issue. We've had that come up with a lot of our CPA clients or our assisted living facility clients, where they have a specific issue only that affects their business and their bottom line that they need assistance with. And so then, that's one of those issues that the entire association's not going to take a position on. I mean, they may in general say we don't, want to increase regulation, but if it's someone who's got a license that has lapsed or they've got a disciplinary case or anticipating something, we could certainly help them directly.
Gotcha.
So one of I would say the biggest issues over the last year or so, I would say probably an unavoidable topic, for just about every podcast we've done over the last, since March or so, of course, has been related to COVID. And, we've heard a lot about either businesses or associations or just everyone reaching out to lawmakers to be able to help get attractions back open, to help with, with the stimulus and the funding. And curious if you're able to share what that has been like for you, particularly in Florida.
Sure. It actually has probably been the most rewarding thing we worked on for FAA. And I shouldn't say that because Bill's going to think everything else was boring. But because nobody could anticipate what was going to happen and trying to navigate executive orders, I mean, the association has a great CEO. Bill Lutfer knows the industry backwards and forwards and reads literally and says, this word doesn't say that, but that's what they said in the paper. And so, the reopening of attractions, there was a big issue, and it was Miami-Dade. Remember, they kept out Miami-Dade County, Palm Beach, and Broward. Didn't go through phase one first, and then they had to turn in, basically a plan saying what they were going to do in terms of sanitation and safety. They had to turn it in to the governor's office. in the executive order, the words that were used were theme park. Well, that's not defined anywhere in statute. So it was like, what does theme park mean? What about this? And so we had to, go over to the governor's office and talk to the governor's deputy chief of staff and chief of staff, and just say, listen, we think you know what you want, but this is not what this word says. And so we throw out an example of like, Jungle Island, or pick a attraction. They go, well, that doesn't affect them. Okay, but how are they not a theme park? What's the definition of theme park? And it's like, kind of throwing the hands up saying, well, we're not really sure. So it was one of those having to bridge a lot of confusion. And I think I say there's overkill, but I think there were some facilities that went ahead, and Orlando was one of them. They had to turn it into Orange County. They probably went over and above what they needed to do, but it was probably good to do it because they're like, I just want to reopen. Lion Country Safari, I talked with Jennifer Bethune multiple times. I mean, they were like, all right, we're going to open. We think we've done everything we need to do. Here's our plan. Here's what's going on. And we'll just wait and see if law enforcement show up. That's not a way for someone to run a business. And I think you saw that kind of across the board. So we were able to specify, really kind of take pieces of these executive orders as they came out and to ask the questions. And I think we did a couple different letters on FAA letterhead saying, can you clarify what this means? Here's why. Let us show you blah, blah, blah. And again, it goes back to that word theme park. We're like, there's no definition in rule or statute of a theme park. So you put it in executive order, which is basically a law. What does it mean? And you don't have a definition of it. I don't think we still have a definition of it, but most everyone's open from what I understand. So rewarding. It was probably one of the most rewarding 3 or 4 months because it was constant. It was helping people directly open their businesses back up. I mean, we're talking to members of the FAA who are saying, I can't make payroll. Mm-hmm. I'm having to cut back and cut back and cut back and cut back. I've got to open, or I'm going to have to start cutting employees, more than what, cutting them completely, not just their salaries. So it was probably the most impactful, I think, that we felt we were with the organization.
Well, if you want a definition of theme parks, just ask us theme park nerds, right? Because we could probably do a whole show on theme park, attraction, visitor center, amusement park,
and how that differs from a theme park.
Yeah.
Yes, it would be fabulous.
Yeah. But no, that's really cool. And when you say it's rewarding, like you said, you got to help these businesses reopen. And I think that's one of the things that was toughest, from a non-operator standpoint, is that in some ways we felt helpless because we couldn't help, right? And we didn't know what to do, and we didn't know what steps to take. And it was great that they could reach out, the operators could reach out to you or, to the association, to Bill, to kind of get some of that guidance. I know here, I live in North Carolina, and there are 2 facilities that have the exact same conveyance of how they move people. One calls it a train, one calls it a tram. One was allowed to open, one was not. And they're almost the exact same vehicle and, open air and the whole thing. So I can see just how confusing it would be. So did you run into any of those kind of, just confusing issues? Like it says one thing over here, it doesn't say it over there, that kind of thing?
Yeah, we did in some cases, and it was, some of it was related to the state executive order versus what some of the counties were doing. And again, it's really interesting. You had to read the first executive order, and everything that came out afterward out of the governor's office would be amending executive order, blah, 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 blah. So you had to pull that order back out and it's like, why don't you just do a new thing that has all of it in one spot? So we saw that between state and local. There was a little push and pull. This governor has been more focused on opening and not having, government, particularly local government, get in the way. In fact, he just put out an executive order this week or late last week, basically saying that local governments they can't penalize, they can't fine, they can't make you, do certain things. They can't restrict businesses. And he was being very clear saying, you're not going to fine and penalize businesses when they open if they're doing what they need, to do, if they've got masks, whatever. So I think it's a really strong message on that. In terms of really just looking at inconsistencies, it's the splicing of words. And a lot of these attractions, at least FAA members, have relationships with their local governments. So for example, again, in Orlando, we were getting information, and the member didn't want the city commission to know we were getting information because they had a good relationship. It was basically like, we're asking the question. Don't worry about that. We'll ask it over here. And I think there are many have, again, good relationships. Jennifer Berthume, funny scenario. She called and she had sent a couple of emails on how things were going when they opened. And they had to, I don't know if it was FHP or Sheriff's Division, whatever, came up as they were, putting people were in their vehicles. They weren't getting out of their vehicles. They couldn't get out of their vehicles. They drove their own vehicles through, and they watched a couple of people go through, and she was like, hi, can we help you? Is there anything? Like, nope, we're good. And there was not an adversarial relationship. So that's kind of helpful. And knowing that is also another thing too, because when you go trying to solve something for someone and you find out that they've been a complete jerk and they've created their problem, we don't see that with FAA. I mean, they're happy people. My gosh, they love what they do.
Yeah, as Matt and I have been involved for a few years now, we definitely know great group of happy, wonderful people. I think Matt, you've called it the Family Attractions Association many times too.
Yeah.
One thing I'm curious too is, looking in hindsight, and I know it's hard to say hindsight while we're still at the time of this recording, in the pandemic, but we definitely know a lot more now than we did in March of 2020. Is there anything proactively that attractions or the association, could have been doing, or maybe were doing to, I would say, expedite the process to reopen? As far as granted, a lot of this was not anticipated, until early 2020. But what are some things that maybe they could be thinking about as far as saying, making sure that that we are always, even in the best of times, proving that we are, checking all the boxes, that if there was some sort of emergency or crisis, that we are looking our best during the best of times to prove that we can continue to operate and open safely if things turn for whatever reason, whether it's a health crisis or whatever it might be.
Well, I think there was, some advice from Bill, especially to make sure all of his members had those crisis plans, emergency plans, whether it was hurricanes or, something else. And everyone saw that just because your facilities were closed and people had to be out of there. But I think one of the most important things that FAA did is put together basically an attractions reopening plan. And we gave that to the governor's office before anything came out. We basically said, okay, here's what they're going to do. And part of it was there was a sort of a federal piece floating around about, and I don't know if it was IAPA that did it, but Bill pulled a couple pieces out of it, and we tailored it specifically for Florida and said, here is what's going to happen, and here's what people are going to do. And here's some best practices. And it was pulled from his members. It was pulled, again, from some national guidance as well, looking at CDC guidance. I think it was the reopening plan for America is what he pulled a couple pieces, but we were able to brand it, put FAA letterhead on it, and send it an official document, which then becomes public record to the governor's office, to chief of staff, saying, okay, here's the Florida Attractions Association reopening plan. This is what we're advising our members to do.
So Jennifer, one of the things I'm curious about too is you mentioned having relationships with the lawmakers and not just people like yourselves, but the actual people putting laws into place and that kind of thing. How does an organization go about developing those relationships?
Well, one of the most important things, you might hear from some lobbyists to say, political dollars. Okay, great. Yes, political dollars are wonderful, but unless you've got a boatload of money, like well into, six figures, the impact is minimal. We've pushed, jokingly, we pushed Bill about fundraising and for his PAC. And I was like, I don't want people getting mad. We're like, yeah, but if we get everybody to give $100, it would be simple. I think he's very sensitive to the fact that, he does not want, members need to pay their dues first. And then if they can, great, that and the foundation. That's always important. I think the more important thing though, because you can't battle that much money. I mean, the FP&Ls and the large companies of the world are just giving millions and millions of dollars. What do? You go back to voters. Florida has, 160 members of the legislature that are in single member districts. So every attraction has two people, one House member, one senator, that they need to know who they are. And so we started, I think it was the first or second year we worked with Bill, and there's a guidebook on their website about a guide to having a legislative visit. And what we kept encouraging their members to do is to bring your local legislator in. First of all, it's probably fun. I mean, they can't give it to them as a gift, but they can come in and do something and look at things educationally. And we started doing these legislative visits in different places around the state, and just, telling members. Gatorland did one, and it was just fabulous. I hadn't even been to Gatorland, but we had members that were, legislators that were like, oh, we know where it is. But doing something like that and bringing a legislator onto a facility, one, they can see it. And if you bring them to sort of the backside of it, into an office, or introduce some staff to them, even if it's 10 or 15 minutes and there's 5 or 6 people there, those are all voters. They're voters in their district, likely. They go home and their families are voters as well. And if the person owns their own facility, they own their location as well, they might, if they're on a very high traffic area, might put out a campaign sign for someone. So we think that in-district stuff is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, that's who sends them to Tallahassee. And it takes time to build. But the members that have done it, once they've done it and gotten over I'm concerned about what do I say, we're like, we'll come down there. Just tell us when, we'll get somebody in there. And then once it's done, they're like, oh, that was easy. It's like, you guys are hospitable to everyone. This is, a wonderful visit. So I think that's probably the most important, I think, for particularly a trade association, is developing that grassroots relationship, their key contacts within these districts. And then also inventorying those. We need to know when it's session and things are crazy and we can't get to see Representative so-and-so, or we call, someone, a FAA member in Broward County, and say, will you call Representative Gottlieb and tell him, or send him an email, because here's what's going on, or here's a call to action, giving them something to do. It's kind of it's a two-way street. So it's helpful. It just takes time to build.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that businesses or associations should be taking, I would say, a political stance that may be related to their issues, but, of course we know the political spectrum is very wide and very, very diverse, and in some cases very polarized as well. So does that occasionally maybe get business owners into trouble if they are perhaps promoting one candidate over another for that maybe their employees or maybe their customers or their guests might not support that for different issues, even if it would benefit the business?
It could. The candidate part of it is tough. I mean, the good news is you have the association is not for profit in this bucket. They're a 501c. Their political committee, their PC in Florida, is a state registered PC. It's a wholly separate entity. And we tell our clients, do not mix the two. You can have a discussion saying, we want to support people that will support our issues, but you can't say, I'm going to give you $1,000 and therefore I want you to vote yes on X. I mean, that is illegal. So we try to keep the issues separate, to say, you want to talk about supporting people that are going to be supportive of your industry. And I think what's most important about that is having a relationship that they know something about your industry. So if I'm a large hotel chain and I decide to take a very, open, public, supportive, pick candidate X, and candidate X doesn't care about hotels, there's no significant relationship, I think you're up for criticism. If it's, someone who is running an attraction and, their closest colleague is going to be running for the legislature, and they say, hey, we as a private business want to support, so-and-so for this House seat, there's a connection there and there's a reason. I think more so the getting in trouble, and which is why the PACs are a good thing. Your PAC does the endorsement, not your, association proper. But I think it's also a good idea to look at issues, even, on top of candidates, issues like, for example, the constitutional amendments that were on the ballot this last election cycle, in minimum wage, raising the minimum wage. That was an issue. And I know, Bill, they had to take a position, and the position was to oppose it. But the reality is, we asked Bill, where are your members on this? And he's like, most of my members are paying above minimum wage, so it wouldn't affect them. But you had the larger, organizations, larger companies that were not jumping in. And largely it was the hotel and restaurant industry that were saying, oh my gosh, the sky's falling. Here's what's going to happen. And with it, listen, we all knew it was going to pass. And then you add COVID to it, and it was even worse. So you can have an opposition. It just doesn't have to be extremely vocal. So you all probably did know that FAA opposed that constitutional amendment. But it was like, we're going to take this position because that's, the rest of our friends in the tourism industry are doing it, but we're not going to go out there and throw everything at this. There are other things that are priority.
So to this point, we've been talking a lot about obviously the lobbyist part and, all the things that you've done. And it doesn't surprise me that you were actually granted an award recently, which was one of the top small firm lobbyists of 2020. So I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about kind of what goes into that and how you earned that. What was it that you did that got you that award?
Good question. So that award was given by the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics, and it's a national group. And I heard a little bit about them. We'd had a few conversations backwards and forwards, and they had been actually rebranded in their organization's name to NILE, to National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics. I've been a longtime member and one of the founders of the Florida Association of Professional Lobbyists, and have served as chair. I had a 2-year stint as chair of the association. We've been in existence about 15, 16 years and finishing my term. And I looked at, they basically had put out, the application and said, they had different categories, and talk about what have you done during COVID that you think has been significant. And that's, we went ahead and applied and said, here's, the size of our firm, here's what we think we've contributed from this standpoint, here's some of the outcomes that we've seen. And they did, apparently we didn't interview, didn't have to do anything along those lines, but they went through, and I think it was really what you had to make a compelling argument about it being significant. And, I think the part that I'm the most proud about is I was the only nominee and only person awarded from Florida. So pretty excited. My team was very, excited about it as well. So we're hoping to have, I think, some additional, I don't think my work is done on the ethics front when it comes to our lobbying organization. And I think a national organization like the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics could certainly be helpful in terms of additional relationships with folks in other states. They're not just doing, it's not just a bunch of federal lobbyists. You got other state lobbyists as well.
Very cool. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, congratulations. So in terms of, you said that there's still more work to do in terms of lobbying ethics. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what happens next? What's the additional work to be done?
Oh, let me get in my soapbox here. So and it was interesting because I was having a discussion the other day with a reporter just about how things had changed in general, just the access to legislators and term limits and whatnot, and how you've got the advent of non-traditional media that, people just look and they go, oh, well, this says blah, blah, blah. Well, okay, that's not a news outlet, and they just wrote their opinion. A couple things I think would be really significant. One is on election reform. And I probably would get kicked in the behind multiple times from my colleagues. But I think it's incredibly important for the legislature to look at what's happening with political committees. So in Florida, we have, you have basically a campaign account that you can raise for as a candidate for House or Senate or cabinet. You can also have a political committee, a PC, which basically several years back took the place of CCEs, which were committees of continuous existence. There were members who after were living out of their CCEs, not using it for campaign dollar events, that type of thing. PCs are, it's unlimited amounts that can be given in those political committees. They're transparent. You can put somebody's name on it. They have to have a website. They have to report within 5 days. But, when someone's got $10 million in their PC and they're the incoming president or speaker, whatnot, and once they're out of office, there's no mechanism by which they have to distribute those funds, so they don't have to close the PC. When you're a candidate, once you're no longer in the House, once you're in your final term, your candidate fund, your fund with Division of Elections, has to be dispersed. You either use it or you give it to charity or whatnot. You see legislators now, and this is something that's been in the paper multiple times, announcing, so-and-so hired former representative, blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, they have a 2-year lobbying ban. They cannot lobby the legislature for 2 years. So you're hiring them to be a lobbyist, but they can't lobby for 2 years. Secondly, we have a constitutional amendment that now will impose a 6-year ban, which will be even more interesting. But you have these people leaving the legislature who've raised money from all of us, And are they going to go out there and compete with other lobbyists? So if I'm looking at one of my competitors, another lobbying firm, I could think of a tactic to say, I'm going to help Representative so-and-so in their last 2 years, raise a bunch of money for their PC or get them to raise money for their political committee. They're a chairman of a committee. People want to curry favor. And then when they're term limited, I'm going to hire them on as a lobbyist, and they're going to bring, $500,000 in political contributions that we'll be able to dole on. It just doesn't smell good. And I don't think there's been any light shed on that. I think I don't see why political committees that are controlled by someone who's in elected office wouldn't be treated exactly the same way as that member's personal campaign committee. It's the same, you're raising money the same way, except one of them is a huge amount of money, no limits, not the $1,000 limits. And on top of it, you're able to take it, after you leave office. You've raised that money while you were in office because you were in office, not because you were a cool person. It's because of the, position you held. So I think that would be one. The other thing I think is a little harder, and that is it is a revolving door of we have legislators who are leaving the legislature and going out and lobbying. I really think you need to pick, or at least don't make it so obvious. It's like, it's one thing to go and be of counsel, or you're an attorney, you go to a law firm. It's great. You have a former legislator, but to openly market and do that, I just think it blurs the lines of public service. And I know that we've reacted, and members that are in their last term or second to last term will flat out ask the question, all right, we'll go raise money from client X for your political committee, but are you going to turn around and start lobbying in the future? No. We ask the question, and it's terrible to have to do that. But I think those would be two things is, the PC part of it might resolve the other issue, and that's, legislators leaving office. It's hard to argue that their influence as a lawmaker is pure when afterward it's going to, a business that they regulated, or a company or whatnot that they wrote legislation for. It just doesn't sound good. Doesn't sound good to me.
Yeah. Jennifer, as I'm hearing you talk about those things, obviously you have a lot of detail and you have a lot of passion around it. For those people that might be like nails on a chalkboard to talk about all those kind of things, or feel like, there's just too many moving pieces. I don't understand it, or I don't get it. What do you say to those folks? Because you still want them to get involved and to be part of the process. So how do you get those folks to be, a little bit more active or engaged?
I think what the most important thing is voting. I don't care what your party affiliation is, or if you're no party affiliation. We have almost one third registration in Florida. Republicans, Democrats higher, and then no party affiliation. So you have a lot of people that are starting to identify with neither party. I think voting is incredibly important. That's the first thing you need to do. Contacting your local legislator, even if it's via email. Hey, I live at 442, East Street, and here's an issue that's important to me. When you go to Tallahassee, I want to, hear about this. The other thing is considering running. We don't have anyone in the legislature right now who is a member of the attractions industry, which is a shame. But it doesn't surprise me, because those people are happy and they're running their businesses. Why would they want to go, have a headache up in Tallahassee for $29,000 a year? But I think that, the voting and the actual considering running, it's hard to to criticize and to sort of be that Monday morning quarterback where you're not willing to do it yourself. And I think there are some really, really good people out there. I know some FAA members we, talked to that are in some districts that, they couldn't win in because it's heavily Republican registration, whatnot. But think about running for local city council. Think about running for their HOA. Getting involved so that you can actually shape it and make a bit of a difference, I think is helpful. People don't see outcomes immediately, and so therefore they don't want to do it. And I think that's what happens with voting. And probably this election cycle, exacerbated that point of view.
So what are some of the ways to be able to get involved that maybe is a step or two beyond voting, but not as high as going to Tallahassee for $29,000 a year, like you mentioned?
All right. Well, the biggest thing is if you have a business or industry that has a trade or professional association, to make sure you join. At the end of the day, when you don't have time to do all of that advocacy or whatever the issue that's important, you've got an organization that is doing it, on your behalf collectively. The other thing is there could be a scenario which you don't want to be out front on, and your trade association could do the issue, and it's not your name, your company moving forward. Excuse me. I think joining an association and actually being active in that association, whether it's on the, the policy side of it or, helping them fundraise for their PAC, but getting engaged with that voice, that trade association, regardless of what the industry is, carries value and carries weight, both with legislators and staff who will say, what does the industry think? Well, let me go talk to the Florida Association of blah, 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 and let's see what they think. And they may not have 100% of the members, but that's going to be the first place they go.
One of the things that I was going to ask a little bit about was, as you talk about people getting involved, what are some of those hot topic things that they should be looking at or should be kind of on their radar to talk to people about?
I think probably one of the most important things is related to COVID, whether it's COVID relief, and that's going to be on the federal level. People writing their member of Congress or the U.S. senators, here in Florida, being able to talk about what are those issues that affect your business that are barriers or are road bumps for you, being able to function. So, for example, I think restaurants are a great example. Restaurants and bars are kind of yo-yos right now, but who can open, how many people, what's the, what kind of mask do you have to have, that type of thing. I think accurately communicating to your local elected officials or state elected officials, whoever's imposing that mandate, saying, this is what this is going to do to me. Or like you see out in California, you've got businesses that are just going, we're going to open, come do something. And you have law enforcement officials that are saying, we're not going to go arrest people if they don't have masks on. I think getting businesses back up and running is extremely important. And I'll give you the example of where I'm at a hotel in Orlando, and I must have gotten 3 pieces of communication, 2 emails and 1 through the app about what they are doing in terms of, sanitation and whatnot with COVID. I'm like, okay, well, if I was concerned, I wouldn't have traveled, but it's nice, certainly to see it. I can only imagine those businesses who haven't been able to reopen, that are dependent upon, or haven't been able to reopen fully, that are dependent upon customers, what are they doing? So I think CARES Act relief would be important, and also being able to say, hey, this is what I need to be able to move forward. And I think we're lucky in Florida. We don't have personal income tax. We're a different type of tax state, which is good. But I think there has to be a huge influx of promotion, like, for example, Visit Florida. The tourism industry, if tourism industry is that high of a driver to our revenue in the state of Florida, you better put a darn amount of money in the kitty to go ahead and start promoting people coming to Florida. Because candidly, you look at vacation rentals or places in like the Panhandle and coastal areas, when vacation rentals opened back up, I mean, you had delegations of legislators all around the state, even some who don't like vacation rentals and like hotels, were like, no, open vacation rentals. Because if you're in Alabama or Georgia or somewhere else and you have to stare at 4 walls, and you can drive and go stare at 4 walls at the beach with, one viewpoint out the window is, the ocean, you can do that as well. So I think I think the COVID relief and getting businesses back on track is going to be incredibly important. I think that's probably the number, and each business is going to have to determine what that means to them and what they need.
How much are industries competing for these relief dollars? Ever since ever since really everything shut down and all these relief efforts went into place, we see multiple associations saying, write to your congressman, your congressperson. And I guess, curious as far as, you look at hospitality, attractions are a part of that, restaurants are a part of that, hotels are a part of that, and kind of all, impacted equally. So curious as far as, how much of each share, each of these subsets or sectors in the industry are competing with one another while all trying to achieve the same goals of reopening their businesses.
Logically, it would make sense that they would be competing against each other if there's a finite amount of pie. I don't think there's a finite amount of pie. I don't think anyone knows what kind of money is out there. I think what they're competing against is a Congress that can't get much done. and is coming back with, we keep hearing about PPP loans and what the relief is going to be, and are you going to be, have to pay back, and these CARES Act dollars. I mean, what came down to Florida was like I think it was 1.57 billion down to the counties, and you had 12 counties that got the money directly from the Treasury. You had 55 counties that the state got the money, and the governor's office gave 25% up front, and then you had to like put a plan together to get the draws. You had small counties that could not even, they didn't have the money in their reserves to draw that 25%. Or to draw the rest of it, and they didn't have the money to, up front. So I think it's more so competing against action in Congress about, and it's probably other states versus other industries. I mean, Florida, we end up being a donor state a tremendous amount of the time. We also don't have a state that is looking to be quote unquote bailed out, because we have to have a balanced budget every year. So I think it's a matter of not so much industries, but is battling and trying to get Congress to do something and to do it quickly.
So Jennifer, I have one last COVID question, but this is a little different because, so many of us in the helping world, have been trying to help other people. And certainly that's been you and your firm's goal through all of this. So how have you sort of taken care of yourself and your firm during all this time so that you could help other people?
Well, we're, pretty small group. We have 6 people. And the first thing I said was when, the shutdown happened and whatever we called it, the stay at home, safer at home order, basically gave everybody the option of, you tell me where you want to work. And we have a pretty flexible situation anyway. I've got 2 other lobbyists on the team, another one kind of coming up the ranks. Everybody gets worn out during sessions. So I'm like, I don't care if you work at home, if you come to the office, if you're, where you need to be reachable during this time frame, and you need to be responsive to clients. And if you can do that somewhere else, I'm okay with it. So for us, it was an easy transition because I was able to say, who's uncomfortable coming into the office? If you're, if you want to come in, great. If you don't want to come in, that's okay. But I want everybody put on the calendar every day, and we do this once a week, who's coming in on what days. There's rarely a time where we're all there at the same time, but when we are, I find that I'm having to say, go back in your office. They're everybody's. It's what folks were comfortable with, and we're wearing. We own the building downtown. We have tenants in the rest of the building, and so we have an indoor mask ordinance in Leon County, and so we basically have told all our tenants, when you come in through the lobby and you get on the elevator and you go up to your floor, please wear a mask until you get to your space, and then you can do whatever you want in your space. So we've done that, looked at, I went to, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but at the time it seemed like the right thing to do, but I went to every single one of my clients as we got like a month into it and said, hey, listen, we know these are tough financial times. If you can't, pay your fees this month, or we need to reduce our fees, we want to keep you as a client, so let us know. And knock on wood, we did not have one client take us up on it. We had one client that delayed fees for like 3 months, but to me, it was more important at the end of to say, we're in this with you. I don't want to have to I want to keep my employees, but we understand what you're dealing with. And so we were incredibly also responsive to clients, and just, it seemed like it was hours and hours and hours on the phone. So we kind of shifted our service to clients, and again, being a little flexible, being remote. But I got a pretty good team. They're pretty good folks for the most part.
Well, that's fantastic. That's great to hear. Also, how has this affected, because you mentioned earlier the importance of having access to the Capitol itself, and then obviously with, stay at home and just restrictions, and now people maybe working from, remote locations and maybe not in the office. How has that impacted kind of how you do business and the importance of being able to get to the Capitol?
Sure. Well, I think the first impact that we saw was really elections, because COVID hit and they shut down the Capitol in March. We had not gone back to the Capitol. I had no reason. There were folks that we, talked to. Senate was open, but you had to call. Somebody came down and got you. And so for the most part, I think people really just were not going into the Capitol. So we spent most of the summer, what we normally do is go out on the road and hand out checks or go meet with candidates. You didn't do that. I mean, we had a lot of virtual meetings like this. Um, gearing up to organizational session, we've set up meetings with some of our clients with the incoming president, the incoming speaker, the appropriations chair, to be able to talk, in these quick little Zoom meetings. But we don't know how it's going to affect us if in January we can actually go into the Capitol, because for organizational session in November, there were no visitors allowed in the Capitol. Members that were up here being sworn in for the first time, their family could come on the floor and take a picture, but when everybody was on the floor, they had to be in another room of the Capitol, and it was, watched on TV and whatnot. So the normal flowers, everybody coming in, getting sworn in, all this stuff, people sitting in the gallery, it didn't happen. And they also did not have committee hearings in November or December. We're not having any until January. So we still don't know. The rules are not out in terms of what those protocols. We've seen the protocols for the House and Senate for organizational session, and it was masks and it was social distancing, and it was, there were a lot to it. It was weird to see, members on the floor of the House and Senate with masks on. It was just, crazy. I think it's going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging because, committee meetings right now, rooms are hard to get into sometimes because you have, you might have a topic that the room seats 100 people and there's 500 people trying to cram in. Now you're going to have a scenario. What are you going to do? So you're in a committee room. You can't be in a committee room. Are you going to have to take reservations? I just think it's going to limit a lot of access to members and input in the process. And then the normal, as you're walking around the Capitol, you just bang into somebody. I can't tell you how many times that we've learned information by walking around and someone saying, oh my gosh, I meant to tell you about blah, 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 blah. Or did you hear about such and such? Or can we go meet, huddle over here on the third floor and talk about this issue? So I think that interaction is going to be it's going to hurt the process a whole lot if we cannot do that. Because right now, the protocols for organizational session were even people that were coming in could not congregate. Literally they said, you cannot go to the fourth floor of the Capitol where everybody will go meet. You can't go and sit there or stand there and kind of talk to each other, which is, again, when you got a lull in time, it's pretty important. It's all about, networking and hearing things. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how it's handled in a situation where Florida has such open public records that I think you're going to hear people squawking and saying, I don't have access to my legislator, or I can't come in the Capitol. How can you tell me I can't come in? And I think it'll be exacerbated by the fact that press is allowed in. In fact, there were several members of the press that were tested for COVID before organizational session.
Yeah. Well, speaking of interesting, this entire conversation has been really interesting. So Jennifer, I really appreciate your time and all the wisdom and the insight you've been able to share with us. If you could let people know kind of where they can get in touch with you or how they can find out more about Liberty Partners, where would you send them?
Sure. They can find us on we have our website, Liberty Partners, LIBERTY partners with an SFL.com. That's our website. We're on Facebook, Liberty Partners of Tallahassee, and you can find us on Twitter. It's at Liberty Partners. Pretty active out there as well. We haven't done anything on Instagram, but or they can email me direct, Jennifer at libertypartnersfl.com. I'd love to hear from folks.
Excellent. Well, Jennifer, as we wind this down here, any final words of advice for our audience out there?
I think probably the biggest advice I would give, again, is to stay engaged. People get disappointed in, I think, in either the legislative process or just government in general. And I think we've all been, we watched the mudslinging over the last, wow, it's been awful. Hopefully, moving past that, I think people can really focus on, have some faith, particularly in Florida, in their legislature. We've got some talented folks that are coming into office, and those that are in office, and not be afraid to reach out and really to say, hey, this is what's important to me or what's not important to me, that they're the ones that send them to Tallahassee.
Yeah, I think staying engaged is a great message, and I hope that people out there will continue to stay engaged and reach out to people to find out more about how they can stay engaged. And for everybody out there listening and being engaged with the Attraction Pros podcast, just remember that we are all Attraction Pros. Thanks for listening to the Attraction Pros podcast.
Make sure to subscribe so you can tune in when new episodes release, and even better, please leave us a review on iTunes.
For more information, visit AttractionPros.com.